the AllThingsXR podcast, where you can get the best ARVR analyzers from the biggest names in the field. Hi everyone, welcome to the AllThingsXR podcast. I'm Mojtaba. In today's episode, we talk about AR and VR on the web with our special guest, Amir Bozorgzadeh, co-founder and CEO of Virtuleap. Hi Amir.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Can you tell us more about yourself and your company, Virtuleap?
Absolutely. We began in late 2016 as a hackathon platform, particularly devoted to WebVR in terms of catalyzing content creation for WebVR, evangelizing what WebVR is, and having all sorts of developers, web developers in particular, learn about it in order to, overnight become VR developers. And about late 2017, we also began working on what we consider to be a very well-positioned analytic for driving VR and AR content, and it's called the GAZA ratio, or GAR XR metric. The GAZA ratio, we find that a lot of the industry has kind of gone about developing their own ways to understand what's really happening in VR and AR environments. Like, we don't really have a customer-centric best practices or toolkits or things that give us a kind of rubric of how to gauge what we're doing, whether it's good or bad, or whether we need to improve the user design. These kind of things are kind of still very, very early stage. And with the GAZA ratio, it's essentially an algorithm that takes advantage of a user in a VR and AR environment, and by taking a bunch of variables like distance, duration, and the viewing angle, and as well as the occlusion of other objects that might be, interfering between disrupting your view of something, we take that all into account and score how much attention any 3D object received during a session.
Great. So, Amir, let's get a little bit back. How did you get introduced to AR and VR, and what was your background before AR and VR and starting Virtuleap?
I'm traditionally trained as a market researcher, particularly digital research. I was living and grew up in Vancouver, and I moved to Dubai, where I lived for about 8 years. And during my time in Dubai, I got into mobile games publishing. And then during the last few years, I increasingly covered emerging technology for blogs like VentureBeat and TechCrunch. And particularly, I think by gravity, just got closer and closer into covering VR and AR in particular. And that was around the same time that I began Virtuleap and the WebVR WebXR hackathon.
Great. Can GAR also be used as the input? I mean, right now AR and VR both have some challenges on the user's input. Many use old-style controllers. Some AR glasses like Magic Leap use a combination of the controllers and user hand gestures. Some use voice recognition and so on. But gaze inputs are also a type of input that can be considered in AR and VR. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's definitely something that we think is very important when creators like yourself consider that as a factor, and that gaze can be an input. We also consider, for example, not just visual input, but what about spatial audio as a type of input? Things like all these different factors, we're trying to understand how to incorporate them into a single algorithm that can score attention, in a way that is meaningful for developers. But it is a very big task. I mean, what you're suggesting is very, very, very true. But we haven't gotten there. I think at this stage of the industry, we're really just coming into how do we even go about defining how to measure and track attention. The next step will be how to allow attention to even drive VR and AR content.
Great. So GAR can be used as analytics tool, right? So
Right.
what are the use cases for it? What this data is gathered with GAR? What are the best use cases for it to use that data?
We launched the alpha version, the Millennium Falcon version of our platform back in March, and we onboarded a bunch of different pilot partners, including Warner Brothers and the emerging tech division at Warner Brothers, and a variety of different startups and companies across different categories to test what they find value most on. And it turned out to be a kind of three particular use cases. One was A/B testing, and so basically being able to use attention scores to understand how to create certain design changes in the objects that you want to be more salient and visible. Perhaps it's positioning, but A/B testing and being able to go back and forth and see how that changes the impact of the user experience. That's one of the primarily most popular use cases. Secondarily, one that surprised us was partners like Janus VR, which is a social VR platform. They were particularly interested in experimenting how do you use attention scores as a particular content trigger or gameplay mechanism. So, for instance, right now cinematic VR is quite problematic in the sense that directors cannot, direct the gaze and the attention and the minds and hearts of their audience the way they could in the traditional film industry, right? So how do they potentially use the attention of a user to help them self-navigate themselves throughout the storyboard and narrative of a VR and AR cinematic or experience? For example, I'm not sure if you used to come across these kind of books when you were a child, but I used to have these books where if you got to chapter 2 and you made a decision, you would go down a different tree of that seems to be the kind of dynamic at play in ultimately what from my point of view at least, that seems to be the kind of dynamic that I think we need to embrace, that the audience is autonomous. They decide the narration tree that they want to follow, and that directors have to create content that is adaptive and flexible to the flow of attention of a user. And so, for example, in a particular setting, even in an e-commerce setting, you go and there's an object on the table, and the object is listening to the user. And when the object knows that, for instance, it's received a 7 out of 10 GAR score, then a trigger would happen where an animation would be triggered or an e-commerce transition would happen. There's a lot of things that in terms of the attention being used as a driver for the narrative, and those are the two most popular use cases. The third use case that we're working on at the moment in its early stages is how to directly convert attention, user attention in the form of how we capture attention in VR and AR into currency. And in terms of the monetization use case, ultimately it drives product placement as the model.
That's great. So, you work more on the VR side, right?
Right now, pilot partners wise, VR is definitely the primary use case, but increasingly, as of a couple of months ago, we're repositioning particularly for AR as the particular use case, just because we are very much centered for both. It's really a matter of making sure that we balance our approach. VR just so happens to be the one with many use cases at the moment.
I see. So, Amir, can you give us an overview of WebXR field and its players right now?
So when I got into the VR and AR scene back in early 2016, depending on how you look at it, 2 years ago is like, feels like 5 years ago in VR years, right?
Exactly.
But I can't imagine what it feels like for those startups and companies that were in the VR field in 2014 or, my God, 2012. It's unthinkable. But WebVR only really began to acquire organic traction with the grassroots community in 2016. WebVR is essentially a JavaScript API that allows you as a developer or a user to load VR and AR content directly on the browser that's on your laptop or your mobile. It does not require you to install anything. It doesn't require you to download anything. It loads and plays immediately as long as you have a URL. I mean, so
Yeah.
let's imagine there's an awesome WebVR social platform called Hubs by Mozilla, and of course Mozilla is one of the pioneers or the pioneer of WebVR. And basically, to allow someone to jump into a VR world with me, all I have to do is share a URL with my mom, my sister, my wife, my son. All they need is that URL, and it solves this question that, in terms of the current landscape of VR and AR, we're dealing with a market that is primarily Unity based and addicted to high fidelity as the
Yeah.
primary use case. And I completely question that, whether that's even correct. And I think it's absolutely incorrect. But that's another story. It's another podcast. But what really is the main value add of WebVR is accessibility and distribution. There is no walled gardens when you're talking about the open web. And so, in terms of developers, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, to learn how to be a WebVR developer is a far easier task and simpler task and quicker task than becoming a Unity developer. So also it unleashes a lot of more talent into the pool of creators out there.
Yeah. Actually, I developed my first AR app on the web, because there were no smartphones at that time. About I think 7 years ago or 8 years ago, it was 2010, I think. I developed it with Flash, and it was a business card. You had to go to my website, my personal website, and it would activate your webcam, and you had to put the business card in front of the webcam, and it would activate some content on it, my resume and so on. I agree that it has its benefits, but working on our browsers has been something that we were promised with mainly browser apps, especially after technologies like WebGL. Some expected that many of the apps will be on browsers, but web apps never took off as we expected. Do you think that AR and VR and WebXR will be the same? And can AR and VR on the web really compete with developing platforms like Unity? Because, you said some of the benefits, but there are some downsides on the browsers as well. You can't have the processing power as of apps in the Unity, or especially in native apps, and they are harder to develop, but the developers have access to more features on platforms like Unity and developing native apps.
Well, from my point of view, I suppose, as someone who writes regularly on VR and AR startups in the sector in general, particularly for VentureBeat, I really have to just point at the fact that we are not a mainstream industry as of yet, despite what the Gartner hype cycle may or may not say, or what all those media pundits and market researchers seem to want to convey. The fact of the matter is we simply are not a mainstream industry. And if we're not a mainstream industry, we have to look at what actually works and what actually is being picked up by users. And so my examples are, for example, LearnBright.
Actually, not yet.
Well, the thing is, from I have examples where WebVR platforms like LearnBright. It's an enterprise training platform in WebVR, oriented to companies and corporations that want to basically use virtual boardrooms instead of real boardrooms and things like this. And 90% of their users are not using headsets when they're accessing these VR worlds. I mean, 90%, and it's a commercially viable platform. So it may not be Duke Nukem in VR and AR, but I question whether the model that has been set up during the past few years of assuming that that the consumer household is the main market for high fidelity experiences. We haven't seen any data to validate that. Unity and Unreal Engine and any of the high fidelity players don't release any of the real data metrics that matter, like retention. We know how many people are buying these headsets, but we don't know how many of them are collecting dust. We don't know really much of anything. So all I can tell you is that with the WebVR startups that I track and I know, it's much easier to know exactly what's going on with them. And we know there are success stories. So whether the frames per second isn't fast enough for a particular experience is less important to me than does the product have a need in the market? Is there a demand for it? Are there users? Is there a high retention rate? I mean, this is all I care about. And from my point of view of WebVR, it's absolutely has its place in the market, and that's what I basically track.
Great. So as you said, we are not a mainstream industry as of right now. Amir, in this round of Y Combinator, Sam Altman said something that was really interesting and at the same time was really hurting. He had a talk on how to succeed with a startup. And one of the things he said was to be able to differentiate between a real and a fake trend. And for an example of a fake trend, he named VR as one of, at least for the short term, that it won't deliver its promises. What do you think about this view? That I'm sure you and I are both against that.
Well, he's a generalist, and he has, Y Combinator now enrolls about 200 startups a year, and that's of course agnostic to any particular sector, and there's a lot to be said when you're in the VR and AR industry like you and I are. We're drinking the Kool-Aid, so we have to also be aware that we are, perhaps delusional. But I do think that we have not really positioned ourselves in such a way to succeed in the market yet. I think there's been a lot of artificial engineering and manipulation of how the market has been established up to this date. And so I think it's not a fair thing to judge. And at the same time, has all the right in the world to say what he says. And I agree with it in the sense that, for example, I do believe, the WebXR API. I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's an upcoming upgrade to the WebVR API that will soon allow developers to create a single piece of content that is playable across the entire spectrum of all VR and AR devices. So imagine I can play chess in a virtual alien world with someone who's playing the exact same chess game with me in the real world with his laptop on his screen 2D versus someone who is playing the game perhaps on an AR chessboard in the park. It's complete cross-modality, cross-reality. This is so early stage of the industry. I mean, 2018 is the first year that we got standalone headsets. I mean, it's just way too early for anyone to judge anything. And at the same time, Silicon Valley through so much money so early that we have a graveyard so high of so many startups that had six-figure salary engineering talent in Silicon Valley back in 2013 and a burn rate so high that they could never make it 5 years into 2018, where standalone headsets is exactly what they needed to potentially be able to be viable in the market. So, I mean, it's just such a mess, and I think it's way too early, and I think companies shouldn't be disappointed necessarily. I think we need to stop listening to a lot of the market pundits out there and stop looking at their facts and figures, and we need to just start looking at what are the most practical business use cases that we can do. So I have one example in my head I just have to share. I wrote an article about a British startup, a VR startup called Virtuleap, and they basically got into the market by offering a solution that allows you to rehearse for TEDx talks and big presentations in VR and AR, which of course you can understand has a huge value for a lot of us. But he had to change his business model like 4 or 5 times, which I write about in the article, until he figured out that ultimately the best model was the one that was a hybrid model that allowed the VR portion and simulation to be pegged to an offline training solution for the same thing. I mean, VR and AR in many cases has just not been properly given its due, its chance to succeed. And so I do think as of 2018, we are now having a new kind of wave. And I do believe this is the beginning of the end of what we call the trough of disillusionment, when people start to regain their confidence about the real validity of the market.
Yeah, totally agree. What was interesting was at the same time, Y Combinator core head Michael Siebel said in an interview at the same time that he wished that there were more VR startups applying for Y Combinator, and he said that he believes in VR more than AR. That was interesting, the different point of views of these two Y Combinator heads. So Amir, about the hardware, do you think that these analytics will advance with new hardwares and sensors like, for example, eye and gaze tracking technologies? Are you watching any specific company that's working on these kinds of hardwares?
Well, it seems like after 2016, which was very much a kind of a spiritual crash for the industry, where really it was the beginning of the trough of disillusionment, when people were really disappointed with the gap between their expectations and market realities. The real focus has been ever since, and even during that time, on making the devices less and less production cost, right? Making content be less and less intensive. Battery life is the most important. Weight go down, price go down. Everything is about efficiency and making things much more effective while bringing down the performance costs, right? And so eye tracking technology companies like Tobii and Fovi and Visual Camp in South Korea, they are all having trouble integrating their solution technology into mainstream headsets, because they unfortunately entail a very high production cost, which is the opposite thing that the industry wants right now. So in terms of what I believe should be the focus right now is low fidelity experiences like, training simulations, enterprise solutions. If you are in the high fidelity space, I believe investing and being involved in the location-based VR, like VR arcades and immersive theaters. These kinds of things, I think, are much more important than creating more and more gadgets. I think we need to just fine tune what we have right now. And I do want to say that haptics is very important, but that's deep tech, and unfortunately, I have a lot more focus right now on just the real practical fundamentals. If I were to want to see more development, if I were to want to say that I'm going to see much more sophisticated stuff coming out in a certain area, it would be in the pods, the VR customized pods that are being designed for the location-based entertainment experiences. So, for instance, I was in Switzerland in early June for the World VR Forum, and I had tried out one of their experiences from a Parisian company called, I forget the name of this, Somnica. But anyways, their experience is called Birdly, and they had a custom designed contraption that I would jump into, and it would allow me to be a bird. So I put my arms into the wings and I could flap. And I have a fear of heights. So when I first started the experience, I was on the top of the skyline of New York City, and I was panicking. And my wife had to come over, and she noticed that I hadn't been breathing, and she had to whisper to me to tell me to start. And I was panicking. I was going to cancel it, but then after a few sessions, I had very much desensitized my fear of heights, my phobia. So I don't think those experiences would be as compelling without the custom designed pods and gear. But those are big machines. I want those to be more and more developed so that we can really gear up and fill up the VR arcades with best of tech that we can.
Great. So, Amir, as you mentioned, one of the revenue models in VR and both AR are absolutely ads. If we compare and give our listeners a view of the future of advertisements in WebXR, what do you think it will look like? Will it be as annoying as today's ads?
It's a huge thing. I wrote an article maybe 5-6 months ago about the fact that 360 VR ads right now are very much trending.
Mm-hmm.
They're very much becoming a sticky model that advertisers are. In fact, Immersive, one of the top companies in the space, they told me that they're experiencing 50% month-on-month growth of demand from advertisers for 360 ads. And while I am absolutely supportive of such a model, at least working for the industry, it's unfortunate that this is the one that's working so well without any other peers, because 360 VR ads are unfortunately very, very disruptive to the
Mm-hmm.
VR content. They're very intrusive and they're very distracting to the users. And so imagine you're like in a VR serene experience, an avatar world, and suddenly you get stuck inside a Coca-Cola can
Yeah.
commercial. I mean, that's the model that's working right now, and I don't think I think all it's going to do is create resentment on the side of the developers, and it's going to probably not create the best impression for first-time users of VR experiences either. So
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that the gaze-at ratio metric that are developing and have created solves, hopefully, is also pushing towards the product placement model. And so even in the AR world of things, the product placement model should be the natural way of monetizing VR and AR environments, allowing those objects to be listening to users, and then basically brands to be able to monetize according to that, very, very precise analytic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. So, I mean, one of the challenges in AR and VR right now, I think, is creating content. We have to create 3D content for them, and they are basically very time consuming. And though there are tools like Sketchfab and so on, it is still a challenge. And one of the things that I really hope that will transform this space and will revolutionize this space is volumetric video. Some companies like Microsoft has studios for capturing these volumetric videos. I'm sure you've seen John's demo a few days ago,
Yeah.
where they introduced the technology to capture these with, I think, a 6-7 sensors, cameras with depth sensors. If we can create something that is low cost, can mainstream capturing these videos, what effect do you think this will have on VR and AR market?
Yeah, like I suppose by the time they really get into gear, these types of technologies that allow us to streamline the supply of plug and play, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
what do you call it? The building blocks of creating environments and not having to spend so much time, and
Yeah.
being able to not have to start and what do you call it? Recreate the whole wheel, from
Mm-hmm.
scratch.
Yeah.
There's a huge boon in that for sure. I just suppose I don't have much of an impact on VR and AR per se. I think it's going to come in and join the party at the best time. Like I just don't know if the timing is such that it will save VR or help us in the industry at the moment. I
Mm-hmm.
think it will only just make it more exponential, the success. Um, it would have been nice if it were at the stage that it is right now 3 years ago, so that it could be a little bit more available and readily available, and everyone's kind of using it now.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like it's not going to necessarily be a game changer. All I can say is that it's going to have huge impact across the board, and in terms of holographic Skype calls to experiences to all sorts of different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly real time versions, and
Exactly.
there's so much work of it being done right now around the world. So, but I do think it's going to be at least a couple of years before we see it really taking hold and taking effect.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly. I'm thinking of use cases like, for example, live concerts in VR and AR, live
yeah.
theaters. It will basically revolutionize the field and also many other industries, I think.
As long as it's not just another what you call it, a glorified version of the 360 VR, and I'm bending my fingers when I'm saying VR, because 360, as long as there's interactive elements at the core of the offering from the very beginning, but I really don't think so. I think initially it's going to be volumetric experiences that are entered into in high fidelity as a very next level version of 6DoF 360 VR. I think that's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff initially, and that's great. But my particular interest is, as long as those experiences that we're employing it, that you can go and be in that experience, and there's interactive narrative and interactive functionality and things like this in there.
So Amir, you mentioned WebXR hackathons. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, essentially, we ran the first edition in late 2016. It ended in 2017, first couple months, and the first edition was run with partners like Google and Mozilla and Samsung Internet. And it was really what I said. It was about catalyzing content creation. And at that time, WebVR hadn't been picking up. It wasn't a very popular thing. And yet, as we ran the edition, it did start to become increasingly popular. So it was really well timed. This year, we ran the second edition, and it just ended earlier this month, just on July 31st, actually. And August 1st, we sent it out to the judges, and the judges came back a week later, and we announced the winners. And the winner was basically Argentina team. But it was very much this time oriented to two tracks. It was either games. You could develop a WebXR game, or you could develop a WebXR education platform, product, content. So it was very much focused into these two different tracks. And whereas last year it was general in theme, you could create anything you wanted, we thought, anybody who would create a hackathon and give you two options, do a B2B kind of education-oriented or themed content, or you do a game or entertainment concept, you would think most of the concepts would come in as entertainment. But no, 80% of the 21 submissions that we received, the concepts we got, over 80% were education.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's very, very cool to see those kind of contradictions to original assumptions that a lot of people had maybe 5 years ago about VR. Back then they would tell you, what's the main use case for VR? 90% would say 90% is VR AR. Games, games and entertainment. Now, if you ask people this year, they'll tell you that it's 50-50. Most people who are sane, they'll say 50% of the real, proper, solid use cases for VR and AR is enterprise. It's training. It's for corporations. It's for adding real, solid value. It's not just entertainment. Technology.
Yeah. What do you think about the overall market of AR and VR, and in what fields do you see more potential, both long and short term?
So I think 2018 was the real beginning of the industry. I think the standalone headsets that have arrived are going to mark the real beginning of things getting into motion. I think 2019, just to be very, very bullish, I think 2019 is going to be, as SuperData has stated back in AWE in California, they stated that 2019 would be the inflection point, and I agree. I think WebXR is going to be increasingly important, and for those who ignore it, it'll be to their disadvantage, because basically, even if you don't want to develop in WebXR and you are a Unity game or Unity experience, WebXR is the best way for you to use promotional content. So, for instance, you create a limited version or restricted version of like a pilot of your experience in WebXR, and that means billions of people with a smartphone or laptop can access and get much more of a taste of your experience. But right now, people, even though I say that to you, most Unity creators will still rely on 2D videos and 2D images to convey their 3D world. When they have WebXR formats completely available to them in all browsers, except for Safari, completely support them. And even Safari will still load up WebVR content with the polyfill to an acceptable kind of degree of performance. So, like, it's absurd for any Unity creator not to have that. So WebXR is a big game changer. I think 2019 is going to be very solid. But I think people should not listen to the pundits, should not read the reports too much. Like, you should read it with a grain of salt. I think you should just really stick to watching the key startups out there that are actually making revenues and finding a solid fit, and listen to the real, the numbers that make sense. Don't listen too much to the projections.
Amir, I'm reconsidering some of my strategies as you talk.
Fantastic.
I'm mainly a Unity developer, and most of our apps and products in Pandar are on Unity. But as a promotional content, you're absolutely right, I think. Yeah.
Think about it. You even forget, regardless what you create, let's say it's really something small. Now that really small thing potentially has billions of people that can load it.
Yeah.
And the point about WebVR is that WebVR developers are always thinking in terms of progressive enhancement strategies. So I consider immersion like analogous to a pool. And the industry so far has always assumed that the only way to make adoption happen is to push someone who doesn't know how to swim directly into the deep end. And WebVR is the only platform that allows people to put their toe into the shallow end and start getting more and more immersed, and then finally they can put on a headset and get fully immersed. That's progressive enhancement strategy. Now, use the shallow end of WebVR for your promotional purposes as a Unity developer. There you go. I mean, it's the perfect complement for marketing outreach.
Exactly. Absolutely right. So, Amir, do you have any advices for startups working in AR and VR, especially after big players like Google and Apple stepping into the game with their own frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be so worried about the big players. I think stay small and just find your niches, and in particular notice where there's a gap in terms of supply of content and startups servicing certain sectors. So I know for a fact that healthcare and education are underserved at the moment. So if you are a serious business person rather than someone who has a passion project, focus on those sectors: enterprise, education, healthcare. Also, AEC is always a very good industry. Not necessarily the architecture, but engineering and construction is very, very ripe with opportunities. And focus on those sectors. If it is a passion project, then I would just take the advice I just mentioned here, which is try to use the full toolkit to your disposal. Don't just focus on one platform when you can use many. There's a reasonable shortage of good experienced Unity developers. At least from my point of view, there is. It takes a long time to get new Unity developers out there and trained. So there's a lot more web developers. So maybe you can find a mix of them, who can work together. And in particular, I think really focus on the idea that cross-modality experiences are going to come out quite soon, and try to even take advantage of concepts that can be usable even not VR but AR and vice versa.
Well, Amir, thank you very much for joining the All Things XR podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.